So it's a joy to have Lisa Coutras with us today on Eucatastrophe. Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa. It's just tremendous. Lisa is the author of Tolkien's Theology of Beauty. It is tremendous to have you with us, Lisa. Thank you for being with us today. It's an honor to have you at Eucatastrophe. It's really good to have you. Thanks for being with us, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
That's awesome. Really cool. So what's, I love right out of the gate to ask just about everybody this question. What's your own come to Tolkien story? How did you start reading Tolkien? What are some of your earliest memories?
Sure. Well, I'd always, I guess, heard about Tolkien just a little bit from my family. My mom, my brother, they both read Lord of the Rings. So I had a vague idea of hobbits, but really didn't understand a whole lot about it. Vague memories of seeing the cartoon as a kid. But it wasn't until Peter Jackson's films came out, and I was 16, not 26, but 16. And when the Fellowship of the Ring first came out, and that was my very first experience of it, and I was so awestruck by the movie. It was so different than what I expected it to be, and so beautiful in its message, its characters. It was so different from the films that had normally come out in our culture. That just the contrast was very clear. And after the first movie came out, I read all 3 of those volumes, at which point I got to experience the story for the first time. You know, it wasn't that I saw the movie first and then read the books. I got to read the second 2 books before I got to see the other films. And so all those experiences of, Durham Helm is Eowyn, like those little things I got to actually experience firsthand without it being spoiled. And I remember getting very into it all. And my brother, who was very into Tolkien already for years, he was older than me, and he just looked at me and he said, "You're just a movie fan."
Oh, ouch.
Years later, here I have a doctorate in Tolkien. So here we go.
Funny how that works, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's funny. Well, you're not alone in that. I mean, a whole lot of our fellowship here with Eucatastrophe, that's the case for. The movies were their first entryway into Tolkien. My story is very similar. And so you're not alone in that, and I'm glad you can admit it and own it. That's awesome. Your book, Lisa, Tolkien's Theology of Beauty, is a rich resource, and I want us to talk a little bit about several of the key threads. I'd love you to shed some light for us on those. So right up front, you say that your purpose is to analyze theological undertones from the perspective of transcendental beauty. What do you mean by that? And what were you aiming for? Transcendental beauty, those theological undertones. I just love for you to share what you were aiming for with that.
Sure. My purpose was to draw out the theological undertones of it all, and how do we do that in literature? Because literature is a very different venue than, say, straight doctrine or something like that. And I will say that as a teenager, I was very disappointed with, say, Christian fiction that was available at the time. And while I've not read it all, I will say that the books that I read, I was not impressed with. And my goal had, growing up at that point, going into college, and then I went on and did a master's in applied theology and so on from there. And so there's this idea of how do you portray Christian thoughts or Christian theology through the medium of narrative. A lot of novels have a tendency to overdo it, or they just tell you instead of show you something. And that's kind of a no-no in good writing. And so how do you really analyze that or extract that or write that into it? And the medium in this case is via theological beauty. Now, Tolkien's tradition, being Catholic, his Catholic tradition holds beauty as very important, very central to his faith. So while a lot of Christian theology that we're familiar with puts an emphasis on doctrine or morality, there's also a central role to beauty in Catholic thought. That while you have, goodness as the outplay of morality, or you have truth as the outplay of doctrine, for Catholics, beauty is the radiance of God's glory. So if it's the radiance of God's glory, how can we neglect that? But there's a tendency to avoid beauty because it can be deceptive when it's subjective. And that's the distinction that Balthasar, the theologian, makes, is that that human beauty, or subjective beauty, I should say, can be deceptive, but there is a beauty that is central to God's glory. And if God's glory is inherent in all of creation, then we can't ignore it. And so it is that aspect of theology that engages with the imagination that corresponds with literature, which also engages the imagination. So then how do you engage with theology and literature? You do it through the imagination, which is through beauty. So that which is transcendental is like a spiritual or transcendent aspect of beauty, which finds its origin in God's glory, because he is the transcendental creator who infuses his glory into all of creation. So that's a very long answer to that question.
It's a great answer. So this morning early, I went for a run, and I'm walking to cool down afterward. I'm out on the edge of a golf course. There's a fountain there, beautiful trees, full leaves. The daylilies are out, green, just green everywhere. And I could not help but think, this is beautiful. God's creation. This is stunning. And so there was that sense of transcendence right there in those moments, even as I was trying to catch my breath and cool down and guzzle water from being done with my run. So I think most of us can probably, when we think about transcendence like that and grasping the beauty of something, and again, love it that you have leaned in, like you have with Tolkien's material, to think about and dare to think about a beautiful imagination. I think your observation is very interesting, that too often people want to run from it because it can be deceptive, or there can be something tricky or a dark side to it. Yeah.
Right. And that's, and what Balthasar will say is, if beauty is no longer good or true, we depart from it. It is no longer, is no longer what it should be. And in that sense, that is the litmus test. Is it good and is it true?
That's good. It's really good. So you maintain that there is this divine connection, the human spirit in God's image and likeness, aspiring to creativity. So your book, all throughout your book, you tap into these stunning issues of creativity and beauty, and then God's image and likeness within the human spirit. Could you share with us why and how you think that was so important in Tolkien's framework? Because obviously, so like in fairy stories, the whole concept of subcreation and subcreators, and but how and why was that so important in Tolkien's undertones and framework?
Tolkien really, the idea of subcreation was very close to his heart, and I think a lot of that had to do with he was building his own world and, in a sense, justifying it, or exploring the reasons why he was doing that. why it was so important, because he was a philologist who studied the history and development of language and saw how intertwined that was with, say, mythology, and that you can't have a language without a mythology, and then a mythology grows into a history, and that history is a narrative, and it grows and snowballs from there. So for him, this idea of creating a world was intertwined with what he did for a living, and so his imagination and his work were very closely tied together. And the idea of us being made in God's image, that we reflect the image of a creator, it inspires us to create because we are like him in that way. And he, being the creator, infused his beauty into all of creation. And so we as sub-creators see that beauty and seek to imitate it. And I would say that as sub-creators, at our best, we would see that beauty and try to capture it at its most beautiful in our own creations. And in so doing, it reflects the beauty of the creator. And so I think for him, he saw it as something of a religious activity, not necessarily to preach or to make people believe or do the same thing that he does, but rather to seek out the truths of reality and capture them in a narrative, and in so doing inspire the imagination and nourish the heart. And so I think for him, being a sub-creator was so central to who we were as human beings.